you doing, kids? We're going to talk about economic systems here tonight. We're going to look at capitalism and communism. Capitalism is a market-based type economy. So, in your own experience, you can reference that market game we did several weeks ago. We were buying and selling the baskets of apples. Communism is a very different sort of story. It's really a dictatorship of the proletariat. Dictatorship of the proletariat, and the proletariat is the working people, the laborers, the peasants, those kind of guys, as opposed to the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is the middle class and upper class people, like managers, stuff like that. And if you took the time to read 1984, remember they called the working people the proles, and that is a bastardization of the term proletariat. Anyway, I made a sort of a chart type thing here so we can do an easy, quick comparison so we can get done this nice and quickly here. Anyway, capitalism, communism, sort of our black lettering here. Priority. For capitalism, freedom is the top priority. All right. Over in communism, it's equality. So freedom versus equality. And I know we talk about equality much more in our, Constitution and some of our founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence. We always talk about equality, 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 but that's really equality before the law. Equality of opportunity. This is equality of the outcome in life. So, if kid A and kid B are both born in a house next to each other on the same block, and their parents make approximately the same amount of money, and kid A goes on to be some mega millionaire and very successful in business and life, and kid B not so much, ends up in poverty. Well, there is an equality of opportunity there. There is freedom. They made choices and stuff like that. So that's kind of, I guess, the idea really behind all that. But they want an equality of outcome. So kid A and kid B are going to grow up to be the same level, socioeconomic status, and all that. Over here in our blue script, the next bullet down is government involvement. Well, in a capitalist economy, which is similar to like what we run in America, government involvement is low. All right. So it'd be restricted to things like contracts, patents, like patent law for people who are making inventions and things like that, so they get to claim their rights and the royalties or whatever money's associated with that invention. National defense, large projects like I-95. Basically, government involvement, ideally in a capitalist society, should be for things that you can't do yourself. Can you get a job? Yeah. Can you put food on your table? Yeah. Can you buy a house? Yeah. Of course, there's always exceptions, or you're down on your luck or something like that. But ideally, in the capitalist society, government involvement is going to be the things that you basically cannot do for yourself. Not a question of, bad luck or whatever. Over here in a communist society, again, we're on the blue script here. Government involvement is very high in the economy. It relies on something called centralized planning. So basically, the government is going to plan the production of all goods and services. So when we think of goods and services, it's things you buy. It's things that you pay people to do for you. Like if I go to Chili's to eat dinner, there's a waitress there. There's staff there that cooks and everything. So it's service type economy. Goods are, cars, refrigerators, dartboards, whatever. The government is going to plan what gets produced, what gets consumed ultimately, and all of that kind of stuff. So it's not really going to be necessarily what people as individuals come up with. It's all government planning. Over here on the capitalism side, it's going to be very strongly skewed towards the individual. Example I always like to use is the fidget spinner. Somebody's making money off that stupid thing. Remember it came out a couple years ago with the little ball bearings and you just spin it around? What's it do? Nothing. What's it for? I don't know. Somebody thought it up and they're making money off of that. Over here in a communist society, they probably don't have a fidget spinner. Or if they do, I doubt they invented it. Maybe they would have brought it from America or some other kind of capitalist type country for some reason. All right, moving right along to the next bullet down here in our red script. Freedom. Freedom on the capitalist side is very high. That's not just your personal individual liberties, but I also mean economic freedom. And sometimes we don't really appreciate economic freedom. You're free to pursue opportunity, start a business, start moving in some kind of career track that appeals to you. Um, that's that's your freedom over in a capitalist society. You can invent things. Your ideas are yours. Whether you write songs or books, or if you invent a fidget spinner, or maybe something super important like the COVID-19 cure, or whatever the heck's out there. But your ideas are yours due to patent law protection, things like that. Um, you can purchase and acquire as much property or possessions as you want and as you're able to. Money, whatever you want. I always heard a rumor that the game Monopoly was outlawed in the Soviet Union. I don't know 100% that that's true, but I had always kind of heard that. And I guess if you think about it, it makes sense, because Monopoly is all about what? Acquiring money, competing against other people and driving them out of business, owning the most properties. That's how you win, right? But they don't like that kind of thing over in a communist country. Here's our red script again. So freedom is low. Your personal freedom is low. This is really a reference to your economic freedom, but it usually goes along hand in hand. Economic freedom and personal freedom kind of go in lockstep a lot of times, just experientially speaking. So acquisition of wealth and property, it's forbidden, or at least extremely limited. The government involvement in the economy is so high that individuals don't get to really make the choices on what gets produced and consumed and things like that. And just to give you an example here, this is from my favorite old economics book, the Holt Economics book we had from, I don't know, years back when probably your older brothers or sisters were here. But this is about the Great Leap Forward in communist China. And I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs here for you. In 1953, the Chinese communists launched the first 5-year plan, which stressed industrial development with the aid of the Soviet Union. China enjoyed some economic success. Impatient with progress in industry and agriculture, however, Mao pushed for rapid industrial and agricultural development in the second 5-year plan. This plan began with what was referred to as the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward established groups of collective farms called people's communes in an attempt to increase the agricultural output of China. Under a system known as the Iron Rice Bowl, farm work was done in small units called production brigades. Government planners determined what, how, and how much communes produced. All output was produced was delivered to the government. In China's industrial sector, the Great Leap Forward stressed production of steel and other heavy industries. More than 1 million small backyard furnaces were built to expand steel production, while light industries were neglected. These policies caused the industrial output to fall dramatically, which spelled economic ruin for China. Misuse of resources also led to low agricultural productivity, which contributed to the deaths of 20 to 30 million Chinese in the worst famine in history. In 1960, China's government abandoned the Great Leap Forward. So there's an example of big government intervention in the economy in a communist system, and in that case, it was a complete disaster and consumed the lives of tens of millions of people. So it's definitely got a downside. Look here at the black script. The next bullet is competition. Competition in a capitalist society is high. You see it in America and in a normal suburban or urban setting. Even if you walk down the street, how many different kind of food vendors are there? I mean, you might see Starbucks, McDonald's, Burger King, Pretzel Factory, Wawa, all in the same street or the same strip of land. That's high competition. Those companies and those people that work there are competing for your money in a capitalist society. So high competition. In a communist society, it's low or Probably none, because, like I said, if they've got centralized planning, the government owns all the means of production. That means you're basically buying stuff from the government every time in some way, shape, or form. Choice, your level of choice in a capitalist society is very high. In a communist society, low or none. Risk is high and very low in a communist society. So, what does that mean? Freedom has risks. You can end up poor. You can have a financial disaster. You can end up on the street. Maybe the stock market crashes. So, with a free society and capitalist society, you will see stuff like very rich people, very poor people. In the communist society, they try to get rid of all of that risk. There's not going to be necessarily like a class system. They try and get rid of a class system. In reality, though, what you typically see in a communist country is there is a class system, air quotes, but the class is going to be more like people who work in the government, the special people, the decision makers. They're going to be the ones who end up sort of in the upper class. So there's always going to be some kind of structured class system. It's just government jobs and things like that dictated who ended up high in the class system. Going down to the black script now, articulated by Adam Smith, is best known as the guy who really articulates the principles of capitalism. In 1776, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, and that talked about freedom in the economy and competition and things like that. Karl Marx also wrote his book many years later, though, in 1848. He writes Das Kapital, and that's known as the Communist Manifesto. And if you look at really the time they wrote these, what's going on? Like, what's going on in 1776? Well, we know that's our revolution. And Smith is not an American. Smith is, he lives over in Great Britain. So he actually advocated free trade. He was actually a guy that said, let the Americans go, right? Remember, if he's into capitalism, low government involvement, don't force people to do things, let them kind of figure it out. And if they make money doing it and it's good, then they'll pursue that. So he's that kind of guy. And like I said, he was one of a very small group of Brits who actually thought that they should just let the Americans go and we'll just be friends with them and we won't rule them. Remember all that stuff with the history of the revolution, like for instance, Americans throwing tea in the harbor in Boston. Well, why'd they do that? Because the government's messing around with the economy. The government's taxing the tea. The government's telling Americans that they can't buy tea from the Dutch or, I don't know, whoever else is selling and trading tea out there. It has to buy it from the British government monopoly system, the East India Company, right? So there you go. There's an example of people getting ticked off for economic reasons and going at the government. So Karl Marx comes later in 1848. This is mid-19th century Europe. He's originally born in Germany. He lives in Great Britain when he writes his book. And think of maybe like a Charles Dickens type scene, like a gritty urban scene, ghettoized, very like dirty. Poor people have to work long hours in factories, dangerous factories with poor conditions, poor lighting. They might get hurt. They might get a finger ripped off or something in the gears of the machinery. There's no safety there. So this is really the time that he wrote his book in that industrial revolution, and you know, children getting put into the factories and stuff like that too. So when he writes his book, he looks around at the conditions around him and how really bad things are, and he believes that there's going to really be a revolution of sorts, and the people that are working in these conditions are going to rise up. They're going to overthrow the business owners, essentially, take over the whole system, really, and just kind of create this communist utopia that he kind of strived for here. he envisioned this happening in a Western European industrialized country, Great Britain, Germany, maybe to a lesser extent France, Belgium, could be Italy, someplace like that. Of course, we know from history that's not really where that originally sparked. That it ended up that Russia, which became the Soviet Union, was I guess the first one on the beach, as they would say, for communism. But he wouldn't have thought that because Russia was not very industrialized. It was a peasant society. That would have been maybe a little bit of a shocker to Marx, but that's how things turned out really in history. Smith advocated this theory of the invisible hand. What is the invisible hand? Is it, I don't know, like that new Invisible Man movie, or is it like that little hand that walks around the thing in the old Addams Family show? No, the invisible hand really is another word for incentive. Why do you do what you do? Why do you make a fidget spinner? Like maybe you just feel like. And then why do you mass produce it? Because you make money. Kids go out and buy them. Their parents buy them. Whatever. It's silly. The Rubik's cube, another like kind of a dumb, useless thing, but people do it. You're gonna follow your passions, and you're gonna do things that create a living for you. You're gonna do things that people will pay money for. You know, services. Could be a doctor. It could be a teacher. You could be an inventor or business person. You run a pub or a club or something like that. It put the invisible hand as that incentive that pushes you to go do things. That's not really present in communism. There's not really the invisible hand. There is no incentive. They believed in this thing called the theory of surplus value, and that's where Marx articulated that all value comes from labor or work, right? So the capitalist business owner only makes money. I mean, that person doesn't work, right? They're sitting in an office somewhere, in front of their computer or whatever they had back then. That person's sitting in an office because you're the boss, and you got other people out there working very hard in a factory or some other kind of business. And how's that boss getting rich? He or she is not working. Well, it's this surplus value. So all the real value in society comes only from work. And the owner, when they sell their product, they're underpaying the people that work there and keeping the extra money for themselves. They're sort of like a parasite, like a tick or like a leech or something that sucks your blood, or a tapeworm or something. They're sort of like a parasitic sort of creature that just kind of leeches off the people that are working. Probably you're going to have a little bit of trouble with that. People in the Soviet Union, I mean, you figure by, probably about 1917, 1918, they have their revolution, and shortly after that they push out the Tsar and kill the family of the Tsar and all that. But so from then to about the late 80s or so, when that, maybe early 90s, I guess, really when that whole thing collapses, you've got a couple generations in there. But if you're going to come out and talk bad about communism in Soviet Russia, you might have problems. They might shoot you. They might put you in a labor camp or something. So for them to actually come around and see, the emperor really is not wearing any clothes here with this communism thing, and they're living in one of the most resource-rich countries on the entire globe, and they can't make communism work, then there's probably a problem with the theory of surplus value. I don't think Mitt Romney is losing any sleep over the theory of surplus value. I'm sure Mitt Romney, ran for president in 2012. He's a super, super rich guy, right? But I'm sure he's not getting his hands dirty or anything. He's a managerial type guy. So he's not out there digging ditches or logging in time on the assembly line. So they don't really take that stuff into the account. No invisible hand, no time times interest, like with bank account type stuff, loans. That they kind of just look at labor as really the only valuable thing there in a communist system. Well, these are two extremes right here, communism and capitalism. But why do you always have to go to extremes? Well, you don't. Maybe you could go sort of more of a middle road here. And this is market socialism over here. And market socialism is kind of the middle road. It originated in Western Europe, in your industrialized countries. It ended up acting like sort of a pressure valve. So Marx envisions this communist revolution that's going to be violent and overthrow the bourgeoisie or the upper class and middle class people that are the manager types, and this big like war, essentially class war, right? Not like a national war like Brits versus French or French versus Germans or anything, but a class war. And it didn't really quite happen because these societies did have elements of democracy in them, like the British Parliament or the German Reichstag, or the French had some different governments that went through that time period as well. After Napoleon and all that. So there were some pressure valves, you could say, and people could vote, not about everything, and they didn't control the country totally, more like we did over here in America, but they could definitely vote on some things. And these were people who, mind you, they worked hard hours in fields, in factories. At the end of their life, their bodies were kind of beat up, broken in a certain sense. So they would vote for things like pensions and generous benefits for people if they, got hurt or lost their job or something like that. So in the Western European countries, this sort of market socialism seeps in to a certain extent, and they never quite have that breaking point where they have to go to like a full communist type country. And I try to be very careful when I throw this socialism term around, because socialism's really, it's kind of a gray area. Like were the Russians socialist or the communist era? Yeah. Are the Swedes socialist right now? Yeah, kind of. A lot of your Western countries are more socialist compared to, say, the United States, or some of the other like more hardcore capitalist / market economies. But it's shades of gray. It's definitely shades of gray with socialism. There are some people on the far political right who say that we're very socialistic now, and in some ways maybe they have a little bit of a point, or they can point to certain examples. Definitely. Anyway, here's kind of a real quick ad hoc definition for market socialism. You're going to see partial government control mixed in with a democratic political climate, and there's some freedom in the business world and industry and stuff like that, but certainly not as much as like a real capitalist economy. So Sweden has always been kind of the poster child for market socialism. And if you compare that to the United States, government typically owns 10% of all industries. I can't think of too many Swedish companies like IKEA. I drive by IKEA every day. I got a Volvo dealership near me. Other than that, I don't know of a whole lot of Swedish companies, but there's a couple. But the government owns a stake in that company. Over here in the United States, the individuals own that. The people who put the company together, or if they want to sell shares off or anything like that, then it might be a conglomerate of individuals rather than just one person. As you see, I have a little asterisk right there next to it. In some cases, you might see government ownership. Sometimes like a company will fail. Like I think it was one of the car companies in the wake of the 2008 market collapse. It ended up being partially owned by the government. The government's going to have a little bit of say in things like the defense industry. Like, do we want our F-18 fighter jets to be made in China? I don't know if we want that. I don't know if we want a communist country that we have sort of an adversarial relationship with making an F-18 fighter jet. So there's going to be some involvement with the government in industry and corporations and stuff here, but it's certainly not going to be like a across the board percentage that they own. Unionization, very strong in Sweden. 80% of the workforce Over here in the U.S., it's probably about 15%. My numbers are a little bit old because I was taken from an older source, but it's pretty approximate estimate. And of that 15%, really a lot of unionized people here in America they're like me, like teachers are in a union. They're what you call public sector employees, because private sector unions got kind of decimated through the late 80s and 90s. Private sector unions would dictate wages and hours and stuff like that to the companies. Like, let's say, I'm just going to make this up, but as an example, say Ford Motors, if the United Auto Workers talks to Ford Motors in negotiations for their salaries and everything for their employees, and let's just make up some more numbers. Let's say the UAW says you have to pay our employees $50 an hour, and they can only work 8 hours a day with a 45-minute lunch break or something. Again, I just made those numbers up, but if you're paying those guys who make Fords $50 an hour in some different country, the people get paid $15 an hour. Well, what's going to be a cheaper car? What's going to be easier for people to buy? So really, you see a lot of the unions in this country are not really as strong as they used to be, and the ones that are there are a lot of more public sector employees. Again, like I mentioned, teachers, but clerical workers for the state, the federal government, stuff like that. Those guys will usually be unionized too. Workers are represented on corporate boards in Sweden. In America, well, I guess if the leadership wants to do that, they can do that, but there's certainly nothing mandating them to do that. So they really tried to go sort of a middle road there with the market socialism. I just wanted to read something else about market socialism here. So, under socialism, taxes in Sweden were among the highest in Europe. The Swedish government used the tax revenues to finance many social programs, including comprehensive health insurance, unemployment insurance, retirement benefits, free education through college, subsidized public housing. Remember, a subsidy is the opposite of a tax. It's where the government pays you to do something. So they'll partially take care of your house. Child care. This gave Sweden one of the highest standards of living in the world. The high taxes that Swedish workers paid were a source of controversy. High taxes forced workers to demand higher wages, which increased the prices of goods produced for domestic and international markets. Moreover, tax revenues did not keep pace with the rising cost of social programs. As a result, the government had to run deficits and borrow heavily to meet its economic and social goals. In the early 90s, Sweden experienced its worst recession since the Great Depression. The 90s were pretty good. I mean, if you don't believe me, ask your folks. We weren't exactly hurting in the 90s. So Sweden experienced its worst recession since the Great Depression. Faced with the need to reduce its deficit, the Swedish government launched a program to limit welfare benefits and turn over production and management of many government services to private firms. So you do see that in market socialist type countries. So it's very easy to, say, oh, my back hurts, I'm not coming to work. Well, if you're going to pay people to stay home and then tax the living heck out of people who go to work, what are you going to end up with? A lot of people who stay home, right? So nothing's really perfect there. Some people in America, I think Bernie Sanders had a really, kind of an impressive run for the candidacy for president for the Democrat Party, but he part of his plank was a lot of the things that you would see in a market socialist type society, like quote unquote free college, even though it just means government pays for college or healthcare or stuff like that. So some of those ideas are popular even here in the United States, but even in Sweden, which is basically adopted all this stuff, they did sort of balk against it somewhat, just because the taxes and paying for it is so very, very, very high. If you look at some of these countries that are in the market socialist realm, you'll also see that, for instance, the military has become like like a vestigial organ, right? Like your appendix, it's there, but it's not really doing anything. I mean, the American military is a huge stabilizing force the world over. You know, a lot of places are going to be pretty messed up pretty fast if the American military pulls out of there. You know, conflict could start up or whatever. Reference maybe like South Korea, right? So it's a huge stabilizing force. What else on market socialism? Yeah, so it's gone pretty well in most parts of like Northern and Western Europe. They have their problems that are typical with this, like the high taxes get people down. In other parts of the world, it's been very unsuccessful. If you look at, say, Venezuela, they went a socialist route, and maybe they went too far or something, but it was horribly mismanaged, and it's very very poor. They got very poor results from this. So there's really a lot more of a history lesson I could go into with this, which I'm not. I'm probably going to set you guys up with some film this week, and you'll get to see sort of the progression through the 20th century, at least, with the contest between capitalism, market forces, and socialism, even mild socialism of like a sort of managed economy like the New Deal. And we'll get tracking on that. But that's all for tonight, so thanks. Bye-bye.